Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and this is my full breakdown review of Avatar 2 The Way of Water. I will give a spoiler warning when I get to the story and characters, but first I want to talk about the visuals of the movie, which, let's be honest, that's probably the main reason why the first Avatar was so successful. The story, I didn't hate it, it was okay, but because it was done so well visually, that's why it was such a big hit. And I think the new movie is not as good, surprisingly. I kind of expected that since they were working on it for so many years, that it's probably going to raise the bar again. It's going to do something even better and bigger than the first movie, and maybe that's why I was so disappointed by it, because I felt as if it's worse than the first movie, even visually. And part of it is just my subjective opinion because of my own personal preferences. I personally think a forest or a jungle or beautiful mountains and stuff like that is just more pretty, in my opinion, compared to scenes inside the ocean and watching sea creatures and all that kind of stuff. And all those flying scenes in the first movie when they were riding those Nazgul dragons or whatever they're called, I thought that was much more beautiful compared to how in this movie they're riding all kinds of sea creatures, even though some of them do come out of the water to fly a little bit as well. And in a technical sense, maybe it's better, maybe it was more difficult to do it. And I know James Cameron has a hard on about the ocean and the sea creatures and all of that, so he fulfilled his vision and all of that is fine. But I personally, in my personal taste, think the first movie is just prettier visually, in my opinion. So I much prefer the forest, the mountains, flying on the dragons. And also I think the first movie was more artistic. It showed us a much more bigger variety of all kinds of different stuff, the different creatures, and by the way, a lot of the land creatures in the first Avatar did kind of look like sea creatures in many ways, and that was what was interesting about it, that it was all above water and yet it kind of looked similar to underwater, but it felt much more artistic. And at night everything was glowing and all of that, so it felt kind of alien, it felt colorful, it felt artistic and ambitious and all of that. And in the new movie it feels as if it's lacking those elements. And even when they showed us the same locations from the first movie, when they did show us the forest in the beginning, when they showed it at night, it wasn't glowing like it was in the first movie, so it immediately felt kind of off to me. Because I remember sitting there thinking, wait, did they forget that everything is supposed to be glowing at night? How come it doesn't look the same like in the first movie? So even when they showed the same locations, it looked less good compared to the first movie. Another thing I liked more in the first movie was all the science fiction elements. When they showed us all the space stuff and all the stuff with the scientists working in that base, all of those things were interesting in my opinion, and it barely was in this movie. I did like that scene when they showed the humans returning and they showed the spaceships decelerating. That looked really cool, and even when they were landing and kind of incinerating the forest and all of that, it kind of made me wonder, why didn't they do that in the first movie? If that's how their engines work when they land on the planet, why don't they just land everywhere they want to destroy all the targets they wanted, instead of sending those tiny helicopters to attack that home tree and sending tractors and all of that? If all they wanted in the first movie was the unobtainium ore, then why didn't they simply incinerate everything from above, as they did in the beginning of this movie? And so this movie felt as if it's retconning a lot of things from the previous movie, and so the continuity seems off as well. For example, they never once mentioned the unobtainium. Did they totally forget that was the point in the first movie? That's what they wanted in the first movie, and now no one even mentions that. Like, did they go to that place where the home tree was in the first movie and mine the thing they wanted there? Because they said that was the richest vein of unobtainium in the area, and so that's why they wanted to destroy that tree, and yet it's never mentioned again. So did they get that ore or not? And they now have new objectives. Now they say that the humans want to colonize this planet because Earth is dying and is overpopulated and all of that. So I guess they want to transport all the humans here, which is not really that possible, since it seems so hard to bring ships over. They kind of imply that there is no faster than light travel because of the way the ships work. They don't have artificial gravity on the ships, and they have to decelerate and cryo-freeze the passengers and all of that. And that part of the movie I did like, but it was so little of it here. I thought the first movie had more science fiction stuff, and also all the stuff of connecting a human brain to an avatar body to control it from afar. All of that stuff is totally missing from this movie. We now have all the main heroes constantly in the Navi bodies, and even the villains are constantly in the Navi bodies. So there is no back and forth from a human body to a Navi body, because everyone just have a Navi body except for the few human characters, which I'll get to. And also because the Navi all look almost the same, it also makes it confusing because there are so many characters and a lot of them look almost exactly the same. So in some points it's hard to tell who is who, especially when it's all underwater and in darkness, and sometimes you cannot tell the bad guy from the good guy or one brother from another brother because they all look like the cat people. And so that creates confusion. I heard it in the audience of people being confused of who is who. And I think one of the problems in this movie is because it's trying to set up a series of movies, a whole franchise, and so they're kind of setting up a whole bunch of stuff for later, which never really becomes satisfying in this movie. And so there's a bunch of exposition, there's a bunch of new characters which are set up for future movies, and so it never becomes satisfactory in this movie because it never gets to the point. And it's basically just a bunch of exposition, so it creates kind of unnecessary confusion, unnecessary kind of filler. It makes this too long and boring in places, and maybe later on, maybe in the future movies in which they develop all that stuff further, maybe it will be worth it. But for this movie specifically, it damages the movie because it makes it unnecessarily bloated and not satisfying. And also because they're setting up a franchise, they're kind of retconning a lot of things from the first movie which are not convenient anymore. For example, in the first movie they said the reason the Na'vi know English is because the humans taught them English. That there was a school for their kids and they taught them English, and that's why some of them at least know English. And so that was a clever excuse for having them know English without wondering how that's possible or using some plot device like a universal translator. So they simply explained it early in the movie. And yet in this movie it's no longer convenient because now they travel to some distant clan which they didn't interact with before, and so how would they know English? They wouldn't want to have an alien language in the whole movie. And so early on in this movie they simply say that Jake now hears the Na'vi language as English, and so suddenly it switches to English, and so it's not really English, it's just for our ears basically. So it totally diminishes, it totally cancels that neat excuse in the first movie. So what was the point of that excuse in the first movie if now it's basically like a universal translator? So it kind of ruins something which was clever in the first movie. And also, how come this new clan of Na'vi who live in the sea, how come they were not shown in the previous movie? Because wasn't there a scene of Jake going to all the corners of Pandora to gather all the clans of the Na'vi to come and help them fight the humans? And yet he never went to this sea clan for some reason, and only now he goes there, even though he doesn't know them. So why didn't he go to one of those other clans who knew him and fought beside him? Why does he now go to a clan which he previously didn't visit for some reason? So it kind of feels kind of like retconning. I guess it's because they wanted to show them differently to the other Na'vi. They were kind of more pale skinned and they have different tails. They have a tail which helps them to swim, and so it wouldn't fit any of the clans we saw in the previous movie because all of them looked exactly the same, like the normal Na'vi in the forest. So all of this also felt like a bit of a retcon, and also doesn't really make sense because wouldn't he go to one of those leaders that he knew already from the previous movie instead of going to some unknown Na'vi clan which he never met before? And also the motivation of the humans suddenly shifted completely. Now they're no longer looking for unobtainium at all. It's never mentioned once in the whole movie. Even though in the first movie they specifically said that's what pays for the whole party. That's the whole reason they're there, to mine the unobtainium. And yet it's never mentioned again in this movie. Now they say that the humans want to colonize Pandora because Earth is dying. At least all of this helps explain that question of why don't the humans just nuke the place from orbit to get rid of all the resistance, to get the unobtainium. So now they're saying they want to colonize the planet, and so maybe they don't want to irradiate it to make it poisonous for themselves. And so at least it gives us some kind of neat excuse for why they don't want to use nukes anymore, because apparently nukes no longer exist in the future. And why don't they use those spaceship engines which they show the ships decelerating and then landing on the planet, and those engines can just burn a huge section of the forest right away easily? So why didn't they do that in the first movie? And why don't they use those engines to immediately destroy that place of the flux vortex, the place with the brain of Iwa, the one that controls all the animals which defeated them in the first movie, which they were trying to blow up in the previous movie? How come in this whole movie they never mention it again? They never try to blow that place up again, even though they know that's the center of the brain of the planet or whatever. So how come they don't at least nuke that place, center of the nervous system of Iwa or whatever? And yet they never mentioned it at all. And also the main character Jake also apparently completely forgot all about it, and also just totally abandons everything that he fought to achieve in the previous movie. So that also annoyed me. They show that now has a family, he has kids, and so now he's much more worried about his personal children compared to the fate of the planet and the rest of the Na'vi. So he just wants to protect his own personal family by running away to the Sea clan and just abandoning that clan that he became the leader of in the first movie. And we never see what happens with that clan later on. That's the annoying part. I could be fine with him personally making that choice of protecting his own children by just going away, maybe because he thought him being there will just attract attention and will just endanger that clan. So I could have been fine with that, but never again did they even mention that clan again, that clan that he became the leader of in the first movie, the whole point of that movie. And also they kind of made his character annoying throughout the movie, the way he's treating his kids and all of that. It was fine in the beginning. I was assuming that they're simply setting all this conflict up in order to resolve it later on, that later on he will realize that he made a mistake, and yet it never happens. He was that way for most of the movie, constantly berating his kids and being kind of a cowardly, not wanting to fight the enemy and just wanting to run away. And also, he's not being a very clever character, because what does he think will happen later? Obviously, the humans came to conquer the whole planet, and it's eventually going to get to him no matter where he is on this planet. And so, just running away to hide and giving up the fight just feels kind of stupid, and I don't like stupid characters. And the same goes for the villains in this movie, who don't really have any clear logical motivation. Unlike in the first movie when they had a clear goal, they just wanted the unobtainium, so you knew what they want. And yet here they just want revenge against Jake Sully because of what he did in the previous movie, so they do everything just to get him personally, and that's their whole motivation. They forgot about everything else. So because he left that clan, they no longer are fighting that clan, even though it's apparently close to their new base. And so don't they view the Na'vi as a threat? Why don't they go to attack that clan anyway? Wouldn't the clan now be weaker without the Jake Sully to guide it? Why don't they nuke the Flux Vortex brain of Iwa place to make sure that it cannot control all the animals like before? Why are the villains so stupid in this movie? So now apparently they no longer are looking for unobtainium, no one ever mentions that. And because Jake left that clan, they are no longer attacking that clan for some reason, and they do clash with the sea creatures, not just because of Jake Sully who went there, but also because they're hunting those alien whales in that ocean, because somehow they figure out they have some kind of liquid in their brains which can be used to stop the aging process in humans. How the hell did they discover that? I have no idea. Did they randomly find a dead whale from the ocean and just study it and then figured it out somehow that it has some unique brain fluid which can make people younger or something? And also it makes no sense, since they have the technology already to put people's brains into cloned bodies, and so technically that should solve the issue of death and aging anyway. So the rich people on Earth can do it anyway, and that's what they did with the main villain from the previous movie, who they now reveal made a copy of his brain and sent it back to Earth, where they put him into a Na'vi body, and now they're sending him back to help the humans fight against the other Na'vi. And so Stephen Lang is back, and he's constantly in a Na'vi body, so we never really see his human form. We do have a neat scene of him finding his remains of his real body, of his human body, and kind of holding his own skull in his hand and all of that. So there were some interesting moments with all of that, but for the rest of the movie he's constantly in a Na'vi body, and he just wants revenge against Jake Sully and Natiri because they're the ones who killed him previously, even though he's not dead. So why should he care that much? Because he's still alive, obviously. So why does he so angry about them killing his human body in the previous movie? So the whole motivation of the main villain is just to get Jake Sully, to punish him for what he did in the previous movie. There is no bigger plan or ambition by the villain, so they just want to conquer the planet, I guess, and I guess they want to hunt those whales for their brain liquid that can make people stop aging, even though obviously they have the technology of immortality anyway, because Stephen Glenn can just be resurrected, I guess, endlessly now. Even if they kill him again, they can just put his brain copy into a new body anyway. So that kind of makes death meaningless anyway. So what's the point of introducing the whale brain liquid as the new unobtainium? That's what they're seeking now. That's what they want now. So it makes no sense. I guess they needed some kind of an excuse to explain why the humans want to hunt those whales in the ocean for something small from their bodies. So it's like a metaphor, you know, to how people hunt elephants just for their tasks and just leaving the rest of their body to rot. And it shows the cruelty of humanity and the wastefulness and the evil of all of that. And all of that is fine, but it's still kind of annoying to me that the excuse is something which makes no sense in the context of the previous movie and even this movie, because they're saying that the Earth is overpopulated. So why would you want to bring a drug which can make people live longer if your planet's biggest problem is overpopulation? Wouldn't that make that problem worse? I guess only the richest people will get that cure, but wouldn't the rich people would be able to simply transport their minds into new cloned bodies just as Stephen Lang did in this very same movie? So that's why it's annoying to me, because it has all these little logical contradictions. Maybe they should have simply said that the wells contain some kind of concentrated form of unobtainium. Maybe they need the unobtainium as their space fuel or something. They could have explained it in some logical way. Maybe it's like the lithium crystals in Star Trek. Maybe you need it for a faster than light travel, something like that, something much more fantastical. But just a cure for aging when they have cloning already and the ability to resurrect people as they do in this very same movie, and they need it for anti-aging purposes. And so that's why it kind of annoyed me. And speaking of Stephen Lang's return, I actually really liked him as the villain in the first movie because he was a badass, he was clever, he was someone you love to hate, he was an effective villain, but now he's back in a Navi body constantly, and so it kind of diminishes something from his character, because I remember thinking he's a badass in that alien environment despite being just a human, and so it just made it more awesome, you know, all those places when he was holding his breath when going out to the alien environment and all of that, because he was such a badass. And yet now he's just a Navi and he looks almost exactly like Jake, and so it kind of loses something in my opinion. And also the whole idea that he can be easily resurrected anytime they want him to come back, and so that makes him kind of cannon fodder villain. Basically, I no longer care if they kill him or not because they can just bring him back endlessly, and so that's a big problem as well. And maybe they should have just introduced a new villain instead. Maybe that would have been more interesting. The one thing I did kind of like is the whole idea of him going on a similar journey to Jake in the first movie, when he goes to the same places to get his Nazgul to fly on and all of that. I know I'm calling it Nazgul constantly, but he goes on kind of a speed run of the same stuff that Jake did in the first movie. And I remember that's something I was thinking about in the first movie when I was watching it, of how Jake falls in love with the planet because he lives there, and yet the villain never really experiences the same stuff. And wouldn't it be interesting if he does go through a similar journey? Maybe it will change his mind, maybe he will realize they shouldn't be destroying the forest and all of that. So in this movie they kind of do something like that, and yet it doesn't affect his mentality. He's still the villain, he still wants to kill everyone and doesn't fall in love with the creatures or the forest and all of that. Maybe that's something they should do in later movies. Maybe turn him from a villain to a kind of anti-hero or even to an ally, because he's now a Navi physically and he can now interact with all the creatures on the planet and ride the dragons and all of that. So wouldn't he love it as well? Wouldn't that change his perspective? Maybe that's something they should have done even in this movie and not wait for the sequels. And maybe it will be too late to redeem him now, because now that he killed people and creatures in this movie, it kind of makes him irredeemable later on. But who knows, maybe they will be able to do that. There is something that does kind of make me think it might happen, and that's the whole thing with his kid, which is kind of another retcon they added in this movie, because now they reveal he actually had a human baby on the base in the first movie, and because they couldn't send the baby back to Earth with the other humans because babies cannot be cryo-frozen, he just stayed to live with the Navi, and he became like a feral kid, because even though he's a human, he's living with Jake's kids, and so he's kind of behaving like a Navi himself and all of that. So that I thought was a very interesting character, who will also be conflicted and complex and all of that. And that's a character with a lot of potential, because it's kind of connected with both the villain and the hero. And so he will be a conflicted character, he will be complex personality-wise and all of that. And yet for most of this movie, he wasn't really doing anything. He was just standing there for most of the time. And maybe he'll become a more interesting character later on in a later movie, but they should have done it in this movie. They shouldn't have waited with that kind of stuff. But we did have a few good moments, like whenever he takes his evil father around and his dad gets his own dragon and all of that. And we do have kind of hints that they are kind of bonding and getting closer. And so the kid is kind of conflicted already, because he loved Jake's family, but he also kind of likes his new dad now, and so he's conflicted. But for most of the rest of the movie, he just stands around not knowing what to do, and only in the very end he kind of betrays his dad to save the whales and all of that. But for most of this movie, he just stands around not knowing what to do. Only in the very end he kind of makes a choice. There was one scene when his dad is going around interrogating the Sea Clan to look for Jake Sully, and then his son manages to convince him not to kill one of his hostages and all of that. So maybe it shows that he's not fully evil. Maybe he is conflicted as a villain as well. Maybe later on he will not be just a black and white evil villain. Maybe he will become an ally against some bigger villain or something. So maybe they will do something more interesting with him later on, but I just wish it would have happened in this movie. Maybe they shouldn't have waited for the next movies to do that. They should have done more of that kind of stuff here and now, and not just make him once again a one-dimensional villain for most of the movie, except these small little hints that maybe he's not 100% evil. But again, I wish they would have done more stuff with that in this movie and not wait with that. That would have added some more depth to some of these characters. It's also funny how this movie had kind of parallel moments to the first one. Remember when Stephen Lang was making the speech to the soldiers in the first movie to motivate them? He was standing in front of a window which kind of looked like the American flag. So now he's making a similar speech in his Navy body and now standing next to a window which kind of looks like the shape of the Pentagon. So I think that's not a coincidence. I think maybe James Cameron is trying to subliminally tell us something. Maybe that's part of the reason people hated the first movie, that it kind of tried to ham-fist all kinds of messages. And so in this movie we have some similar stuff, but I don't think this movie is really that so-called woke and all of that. It doesn't really have those things, except I guess the main character of Jake Sully being kind of castrated and showing to be cowardly and pathetic and all of that. And of course it has all the environmental messages like, poisoning the planet is bad, burning the forest is bad, hunting the worlds to extinction is bad. But these are all such universal, simplistic, obvious things anyway, that I wouldn't even call it woke in any way, because it doesn't really push any specific agendas except those few things I mentioned. So overall I wouldn't say it's a woke movie. Even the first one had more kind of political messages, more so than in this one in my opinion. And we also have a bunch of new characters of all of Jake's children, and a lot of them look exactly the same, so it makes it confusing unnecessarily. And also we have the daughter of Grace, Sigourney Weaver from the first movie, who is also played by Sigourney Weaver, and they revealed that her body, which stayed alive, her Navi body from the first movie, stayed alive and somehow became pregnant, and they kept her in that tube where they're growing the Navi bodies, and delivered the baby from her, and then she grows up into a teenage Sigourney Weaver with the same voice, and she has some kind of connection with Awa. And that's another one of those things which they're setting up for a future movie, but it's not really satisfying in this one, because in this one it's all exposition without any explanation or a resolution or a satisfying showdown. So it's more of those problems of setting up all the next sequels and just leaving all that stuff for them. And this one is just a bunch of exposition with no explanation. I guess when she was connected with Awa, when they tried to transfer her brain to the Navi body, she kind of became connected with Awa, and maybe this daughter is kind of like a virgin birth. Maybe it's a personification of Awa in a Navi body, combined with Sigourney Weaver somehow, and she'll be the next chosen one, she'll be the savior, she'll be the one to talk with all the animals and all of that stuff. We do have a scene of that toward the end of this movie when she controls some of the sea creatures to save the day, but again it wasn't really that epic. It wasn't a big scale, it was kind of a small scale thing, because I guess they're saving up the big stuff for future movies. And again, it's a problem. It should have been in this movie. They should not be postponing that kind of stuff as a TV series, kind of postponing it till the next season or the next episode. They should have done more of that stuff here and now. Make it more epic now, because again, the first movie was better because it was much more epic right away. It wasn't leaving things for the future movies. It did everything in one movie, and that's why it was faster paced and more epic and satisfying right away. And again, maybe when I see the next movies, maybe it will be worth it. Maybe all the amazing stuff will be later, and this movie is just a stepping stone, just an exposition. But again, it makes this one less good in my opinion. And Stephen Lang basically goes on a speed run in the same journey as Jake in the first movie, but he did it in 2 minutes and just immediately knows everything that Jake does, and then he hunts him for the rest of the movie, just him personally. That's the whole goal of the villains. He constantly captures his kids to try to get him to surrender to him, and so he had plenty of opportunities to just kill all his kids, and yet he doesn't do it. So maybe he's not all evil, I guess. Maybe that's why he didn't, because wouldn't that be the best way to hurt him, to simply kill his kids, to make him suffer emotionally? But no, he just wants to kill him personally, I guess. And so there's like 5 different times when he captures all of his kids and threatens them, and then Jake manages to save them, and then later on in the movie the same thing happens again and again and again, at least 5 times. And so that was also very repetitive and it became boring, and I kind of stopped caring at some point. I thought, just kill them already. Why are you being such a stupid villain? You're still alive, so why are you so angry about him killing your previous buddy when you obviously have a superior one now? Shouldn't you be thanking him? And why don't you fall in love with the forest and the creatures, since you go on the similar journey to Jake in the first movie and you seem to be enjoying all of this, so why are you so angry? And so none of this makes much sense. And then somewhere in the middle, this movie suddenly turns into Free Willy. Suddenly one of Jake's children meets some whale in the ocean, and the whale saves him from drowning and he becomes its best friend. And suddenly they reveal the humans are actually hunting those whales for that thing I mentioned earlier that makes people immortal, even though they have the technology to do it anyway. And we have a disturbing scene of them hunting and killing a whale mother and her baby just because they want to get that little bit of that stuff from her brain. And then the Navi sea creatures are really angry, and so they want to go and fight the humans. And once again, Jake is now a pacifist and says, no, you cannot fight the humans, they will destroy you, just run away and hide and all of that. So Jake has been pathetic for most of this movie, as I mentioned. And that whole subplot with the whales kind of came out of nowhere. There was no setup of it. Suddenly they reveal, oh, each of those Navi who live in the sea is bonded with a specific whale, which was never mentioned before. Suddenly it becomes part of the plot. Suddenly the whole movie is about that. Suddenly that's the motivation of the humans to hunt the whales, even though it was never mentioned before. Suddenly it became the focus of the whole movie. So it became like a Free Willy combined with Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home, and it was all about saving the whales, combined with Moby Dick, because there's some kind of captain who loves hunting those whales. He really enjoys it. And there's a funny moment when that first whale we saw that is missing a fin starts to fight back against those hunters, and it manages to somehow randomly, by total coincidence, tie a rope against that evil captain, and it manages to cut the hand of that captain before he flies off into the ocean. So that part was really kind of funny to me, because of how silly it was. It was almost kind of a so bad it's good moment. It's like totally random, by total coincidence, it just happens to cause him the same injury that he gave him. So that's like poetic justice, but it makes no sense that it just so randomly happens so conveniently. At least that scene was entertaining because it kind of made me laugh because of how silly it was, and it kind of made me remember that line from Revenge of the Sith saying, "It is only natural. He cut off your arm and you wanted revenge." So that scene was totally silly, but at least it was entertaining because it was kind of funny. And again, visually this movie is really good in many places. There's a lot of nice visuals, but I don't think it's as good as the first movie because it's not really as creative, it's not as artistic, it's not as beautiful, and it's not even as epic because, you know, the final action scenes in this new movie are just not as good in my opinion. It's more boring. There's a lot of scenes of people just being stuck under deck with the water rising as the ships are sinking, and swimming through dark corridors and all that kind of stuff, which is not as interesting and not as fun as those epic scenes in the first movie with all the dragons flying and the fights with the robot power armor and all the animals attacking everyone and all of that. So the first movie was a lot more epic, a lot more diverse with its scenery and its creatures. It was a lot more fun in my opinion. And this movie, it's technically good, but it's not as fun as the first movie's action scenes were in my opinion. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of repetitive scenes of the kids being held hostage again and again and again. All the stuff with the personal drama of Jake's kids and their interactions with the kids of the Sea Clan. All of that stuff wasn't really, you know, original or that interesting. It was basically teenage drama stuff, but in the Navi culture. I think a lot of that stuff could have easily been trimmed down. I think this movie overall easily could have been 2 hours without losing anything. Simply shorten some of the unnecessary stuff, simply not do all the repetitive stuff of the same thing happening again and again. It could have easily been trimmed down to 2 hours and it would have been easier to watch, because toward the end of the movie, because it's so long, you kind of don't care anymore, you just want it to be over. And I heard that also in the audience, a lot of people were kind of moaning and wishing the film to be over already. And we did have a bathroom break in the theater I was watching, so it wasn't because of that. Everyone did go and get to pee before continuing the movie, but still it felt too long. It felt like it was dragging, it felt kind of boring, unlike the first movie. As I said in the beginning, I never felt bored watching the first movie, and I watched it a bunch of times, and I think it had much better pacing, it was much more interesting. So I think I covered most of the things I wanted to talk about. So let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.